Hey everybody, welcome back to The Art of Change. My name is Tony Stark Fernandez, the Change Catalyst, and Series 3, we're going to talk about Compassion Unleashed. Compassion is our next series going after the last series of Empathy in Action. And what we're going to do here is tie everything we've been talking about together and how do we apply that in the actionable context. With me today, I have Julie Krause. And Julie, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell everybody your background.
Hi, everybody. So like Tony said, my name's Julie. Just a quick rundown on me. I have a master's degree in art therapy and counseling, and I've worked for nearly a decade. It's transitioning from mental health hospitals to working in humanitarian aid emergency response. In fact, I just returned last week from working 8 months in Ukraine. I've also worked in places like Pakistan, the US-Mexico border, and things from refugee camps to all kinds of settings.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being here, Julie. We really appreciate it. And thank you for your service and everything you've done for the cause. And what we're going to go into today, really want to talk about how do we take empathy, and now we're going to take and apply it into compassion. And so what I think is crucial, we'll first talk about is understanding, as we've gone through the series, empathy is a very passive capability, right? And yes, we do want to have empathetic leadership, but then how do we take that empathy and apply it to help our members so that way they can get to their best level possible and into an optimum area for success? And so if you can briefly, how would you describe for the audience empathy versus compassion, and what are the difference?
Well, if you look at empathy, right, it's feeling with someone. I mean, that's typical in terms of what you learn in school. But that really looks different when you're actually doing work of empathy and compassion, especially for leaders. When you're looking at something that's compassion driven, right? It's what's underneath everything. And so it's not just feeling with, it is so much more layered than that.
Good. And what about compassion?
With compassion, right? I think the biggest thing is thinking about what that drive is for the person, right? Especially like you're talking about with leaders. What drives that person to want to make their team better, want to facilitate things happening so that the outcomes are positive and what you're looking for, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one of the things I think about when we talk about empathetic leaders and as we sit through these, scenarios, I want to talk about some of our experiences, but, a lot of times we feel like our bosses don't hear us, right? We feel like our organizational leaders maybe don't quite get what's going on, right? I got this, personal, and sometimes we don't want to divulge that. We don't want to bring that into the work center, but what a lot of us, realize as we go through time is that we have to be allowed to create safe spaces for our people. And so, in a time of need, as leaders, we do need to be empathetic to what's going on, but then on top of that, how do we apply what we learn from our members through empathy and help them get through, whether it's a performance issue, whether it's personal issues, whatever it could be. And that's when I want to tie it in and back to the motivational interviewing we talked about in series 1. And so motivational interviewing, I chose to start that series first because I wanted to talk about crucial techniques and abilities that is it's not something that is naturally practiced by everybody, but it involves active listening. It talks about taking reflective, speaking to moving into the change talk. And that's one of the ways that we as leaders can apply that empathy into compassion by helping members go into how to change what's going on so they can improve and be better. And when I talk about motivational interviewing, I think it's crucial for people to understand if you allow members to find the solution on their own and you guide them right to those solutions, think of it like a facilitator. We have an end result as a leader we need these members to get to, but
Sure.
Is it as effective for us to direct, or is it more effective for us to listen, help guide, and find a common ground of solution that empowers both sides, right? It empowers the member, but on the flip side of that for the organization, it allows our members to succeed and step up and become back to normal, or take members maybe that were struggling prior to, and then allow them to get to their maximum capability. And so things like, in empathy, we talked about burnout and all kinds of other things that can come for it. But what do you think from your experiences, what would you say are some actions you've seen from leaders who have applied, empathy and then also led into using compassion to help others?
Sure. And I was going to say, I have a lot of global experience from that. I'm just thinking about some of the individuals that I've had above me, right? There's very much a difference between a manager and a leader. And the reality is, if you look at it, how often are leaders actually trained how to be leaders, right?
Absolutely.
That's my biggest question. And not everybody has the same kind of, lovely experience of going through school to learn how to become a counselor, a psychotherapist, a psychologist. And so all of those key pieces that drive someone to actually be a leader, right? They're missing.
Yeah, and I think you hit a good point here. There's managers and there's leaders, right? And not, military, right? We talk about everybody's a leader. If everybody's a leader, nobody's a leader, right? We don't need too many chiefs in the pot, right? And maybe cooks in the kitchen. But being a manager is not a bad thing. But people have to understand that there's a time and place for managers, there's a time and place for leaders, and there's different ways and roles for these different positions. And so, just like being a leader, sometimes you have to be a follower. Right. And so, it's one of those when people I often hear people, they'll say, well, that person's not a leader. They're just a manager. Being a manager is not a negative thing. However, we kind of started putting a negative connotation to that. But the difference is when do we need to apply being a leader for our people? Right.
Right.
And so, Simon Sinek talks about, you have to be, these people are not who you're in charge of. These are the people that you have charge over, right? Your job is to take care of these people. And so if we often as leaders, in series 2, I talked about, if we leaders are always going after the high performer who's doing great and giving them praise, right? And then the ones who are underperforming or struggling or having issues, that's the ones we should be focusing on. Right. And so if you're a leader that only pays attention to the good, positive people, you're missing out on an opportunity to really develop your organization. And then in return, your retention's not going to be there. You're going to have a lot more disciplinary issues. You're going to just have a lot more things that are struggling. And what if you could change that? What if you could apply the empathy and then turn that into an actionable use of compassion to help your members get to where they succeed?
Well, it's a lot of guidance, right? And again, I feel particularly lucky with the background that I have because there's also the reality of supportive supervision. Right. So you're having meetings, you're talking about these things with your team, and it's a safe space and you have boundaries and you kind of set everything up in a very successful way to be able to be open, be vulnerable, identify where the gaps are and where you need support in growing. Right. And that looks different than a normal just team meeting where you're like, have all of the bullet points, you're jotting everything down of like, okay, this is what's happening this week, this is what's happening this month, da 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 da. It's like what everything that's underneath all of that, right? And what can help support. And it's a lot of mentorship. And I think there's that component that's missing as well.
Yeah, one I want to focus on here that I think you did a great job. We start talking about tasks, right?
Right.
Leadership is not a checklist.
Correct.
And so many people look at, okay, well, if this is going on, then I need to do this. And you can't do that. And that's one of the reasons why I have this series and my workshops on evolutionary leadership, because I want to help get the word out here, right? We're talking about adaptable leaders. And
Correct.
Adaptability means you have to be able to form to what your members need. It's not the other way around. Some leaders are always like, well, they need to adapt to my leadership style. That's incorrect. That's not how you run an empathetic, compassionate leadership, right? You have to be able to adapt to those members' needs. And so, when we talk about that task, we talk about those checklists, right? It's really important to understand, yes, your tasks and your things we have to get done for the organization can be in a checklist format, but how we take care of our people is not. And so, when we go into here, one of the things I want to talk about here are some of the actual like core concepts of compassion. And a lot of these are pretty much, the minute I start mentioning it to everybody, you're going to, our audience should be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or those click. But for some reason, sometimes we have a hard time applying that as leaders. And if we think about this, the best friends we have show compassion, right? They take care of each other, right? We do it. We give without expecting to receive. We want people to be able to be empowered to feel and do better, right? That's what hopefully everybody's goal should be, right?
And you continue to show up. That's the biggest thing.
I love it. That word right there, show up. I had a mentor of mine that was one of the best lessons he ever taught me was you show up for your people. And sometimes people think that's physically being present. And yeah, that's a big thing. But it's not just being present. It's also being active with them and interacting. And, for example, if you have a member who has a loss in the family, right? A checklist would be, I need to make a phone call to this person, make sure they're okay. And then you never hear from them again, right? Oh, as a leader, I've done my due diligence by calling them, but that's not what we're talking about here. Compassion, empathetic. If you care, you continually check with making sure your people are okay. Obviously not overdoing it, but gauging the person, right? Making sure our people are okay, helping them through these examples. So for example, some of the core stuff we talked about here is obviously empathy. You can't have compassion without empathy, which is why I started the series in series 2 with empathy. Without empathy, you have no compassion. You have to be able to feel what your members are going through to be able to apply the actionable into it. Now, that does not mean that you have had to experience what your people have gone through, right? But you have to be able to feel what they're feeling. And that can be hard, especially depending on what the situation is. Another one is, we'll talk about intentional kindness. And that's not to say fakeness, right? So intentional kindness, right? So I want to hit this one. What would you say is the difference? Because I would say, and I think everybody in the audience can agree, I've seen when a leader's being a fake kind to my face.
Right.
Versus intentional kindness is simply really putting the feelings. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, people in general, right? Like we are built to engage with one another. That is just at the core of who we are as beings. And so you can tell if someone's they have that fake smile plastered on their face, right? And they're doing those like tick box exercises, right? Okay, I know I need to do X, Y, and Z, right? To fit that. But there's that difference of that. And a really good example of, a team member that I was working with actually fairly recently, I was just struggling really, really hard. And I've led teams from just a few people to over 150 people that I was in charge of on my own. And, it had been months and I was like, why can't I get to this person? Well, finally, she was working remotely one day. I knew she had dogs, and I was just like, hey, I've never seen your dogs. And it's just something as simple, right? So I was making those connections and, and I asked, I was like, can I see him? Because I love dogs. Let me see your dogs. Legitimately, it was it was day and night. The next day that I saw her, anytime we were engaging, she's making those connections with me and she's actively seeking out my support, which is great because she needs a lot of support because she's newer in the work that she was doing. Right. And so it was that difference of me chasing her to her actively now coming and trying to strengthen and telling me where her gaps were.
You hit a really good one. I love the word connection, right? Mm-hmm. You have to connect with your people, bottom line, in whatever form or fashion that is. And sometimes that's going to be hard because a lot of people have been burned by leaders.
It's not easy.
It's not easy.
No.
And if you've had leaders take advantage of that, they're going to have a hard time building in there. But if that's where the intentional kindness is so crucial, because when they can tell that it's meant and there's backing behind it, that you care, those walls come down. The vulnerability opens up and more importantly, the safe environment where they can be open and honest and solve the, whatever's going on, is crucial. And you have to create that safe environment. That high trust culture is crucial, which is what we're talking about here. So another one I want to take, I've covered active listening quite a bit. The only thing I'll point on this is that I want to make sure the audience remembers there is a difference between listening and hearing, and listening to wait to speak. And so it's really important, if you're going to be an active listener, to really apply the idea of listen, absorb, and don't worry about responding, right? At some point you will. And if you're ADHD like me, you want to respond right away, right? But you got to listen, because even though, you want to help them right away when you hear something trick, it's more important for them to feel that they're being heard.
Yeah.
Right. And so go ahead.
I was just going to say, people process differently, especially when you're looking at people that are on the scale of being neuroatypical, right? They might not process in the same way that someone who is neurotypical will. And so that's where, kind of jumping into to respond to support, even if it's with good intentions, it can be challenging and it might not be received in the way that you're seeing it, right? So it's really kind of being able to take that step back, because if you're not doing that, then you're just plowing through like a bulldozer.
Yeah.
And then what's happening?
And another one that you talked about was, you've led small teams to these large organizations. I want to hit a key point on here is when we start managing, and I'm going to use the word managing right now on purpose, managing 150 plus teams, right? You can't give one-on-one to everybody. And so what's important to understand is as a leader in charge of that space, we're creating other leaders.
Yes.
And so as you're building and you're growing up in the echelon of organizational leadership, just because you become a higher level where you have a lot more people, you're a leader of leaders is what I call it. Leader of leaders. Creating that empathy and compassion through your chain. We want to spread the ability to our team, right? We're not the only leader. We want all of our leaders to have the same core principles, the same values, and create that same trust. We can't do it alone, right?
Well, but you're empowering your team, the ones who you are building to be leaders.
Absolutely.
You're empowering them, and then you're trusting that what they're doing is with the same mindset and goals that you have, because you're having those, moments where you're having mentorship and supportive supervision, and you have those touch points, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we go into here, we have, purposeful responses, that's easy. And some of the other concepts of, the big one we talk about, it's a big buzzword, inclusivity, right? Diversion and inclusiveness. And really, so think of it, one of the things I always think about is a lot of times as leaders and I'll say managers again, is we think that because we're in these positions, we have to dictate and then we have to direct. And a lot of good leaders in my time I have experienced often bring our people into the decision-making process, not simply run as an authoritarian type of style. And so, yes, there's a time and place for your position as a leader, right? And you're hired in a position to make hard decisions, but that doesn't mean you have to make every decision. Correct. And so it's bringing your people in. That inclusivity is really, really another way where you create a trusting environment, because when they feel heard, and what I see and what I feel matters. It could be as simple as something very, very minor to major decisions. And then at the end of the day, our job. I'll go back. I had a good mentor once tell me. I remember I had a hard time delegating when I first started getting into some leadership positions, because I didn't want my members to feel like I was pushing all the workload on them, right? And I remember my mentor said, handle the task or the responsibilities that can only be done at your level, and other things push down as appropriately. Now, it's crucial, as we say, as appropriately, because we don't want to task saturate. So that's one, it can be on your level because your team already has too many tasks, or you're pushing it down because at the end of the day, you have to focus on your areas and they need to focus on theirs. But that doesn't mean you can't do their stuff. But we have to be careful on managing how we do that. But I thought that was a really great point that my mentor once gave me, was handle what's at your level and top cover, right? Like, things that don't need to be filtered all the way down, because we don't need to put all the burden and the weight on our people. We need them to be able to operate freely. Right.
Well, and again, it really is about empowering, right? And knowing that they have the backup. I'm just thinking about, again, like when I've led teams and I allow them to make decisions that they're unsure of, but I know that it's a good decision, right? And I make sure that I remind them, hey, like if something happens, it's on me. Right. As a leader, I'm the one, if there's something that's going to come back, there's going to be a problem, I will be the one. That's my role. That's the importance of having someone who's leading that.
Yeah. Let's go into this real quick. As we're closing to this episode, two things I want to hit. One, you just talked about, you kind of led into it, which is failing. Right. A lot of leaders are worried to fail or risk adverse because they don't want to fail, right? And I hate using the word fail, so we'll say, the solution didn't come out the way we expected the first go.
Yeah.
But we learn from those things. And so as long as you're willing to learn, and when you bring those decision makings, yes, as a leader, we're going to take the hit. If you're putting the hit down to your members, you're not doing it correctly, right? But we have to allow our members to be able to make those decisions. I'll take the hit every time if they're coming up with new ideas. Right. And so letting them not feel the brunt of the top coming of like, okay, we still haven't found a solution. Hey guys, keep thinking through it. I got this, right? And our job as leaders, take those hits.
Yep.
It's okay. As long as you're giving good direction, and we're trying to get to the same goal, just because we didn't get it right the first time doesn't mean we're not going to find a solution. But if you never try, we're never going to get there. Right. Second thing I want to hit real quick as we close this is, as we're talking about the foundation of empathy to compassion, what do you think is a critical trait for leaders with compassion today? And what are some misconceptions about that?
That's a hard one.
Had to end it with a good one.
I know.
Let's start with the first one. It's just, when we look at it, what is a critical trait for compassion? I would say,
I was going to say, what do you see?
I would say
Right.
active listening.
But more
But
than
again,
that.
active listening, yeah, exactly. I say, but active listening is still the passive. It's still the empathetic side of compassion.
It's layered,
Yeah.
right? It's utilizing all of those pieces. It's utilizing the mentorship. It's people who are actually excited to be part of the team and to be leading their team, right? It's what the drive is, right?
Yeah, and I would say so. It's hard to hit what one critical trait is on compassion.
I was like, you can't limit me to one. You know this.
It's kind of a setup question, but what I will say is one of the things that I found is the most joyful thing about being a leader is when you see your members thrive through and press and see how they bounce out of whatever issue it is. And sometimes it's not about a negative thing. Just sometimes we have a hurdle and we have to be compassionate through whatever the task that they're struggling with is. And not just say, well, just get it done. That's not a helpful, way of guiding.
Yeah.
But saying, okay, we found a task we have to get done. We're having some hurdles. Guys, let's get together. Let's kind of walk through it, right? And it's not always up to the one person to figure out the solution. And that's how you create
that's why
that
you have
team.
teams.
Yeah, that's why we create that team, that high trust. And so it's important to, if people don't feel like there's a team and that they're on their own, that just adds to that stress and that level. So then big one, let's on a wrapping up of before we go into episode, 2 is what are some misconceptions about compassion? And I'll start, and it's a lot of people think they're providing compassion when really what they're providing is sympathy. And I bring that up because a lot of people misunderstand, the words sympathy, empathy, and compassion.
Right.
And so to make it simple with everyone is compassion is the action, right? And so when we're looking at being sympathetic or being, having that empathy, what are you doing to help the individual through? That's the compassion you show to get through whatever it is, right? So what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Again, trying to wrap things up with me, especially when it comes to the idea of compassion, right? The biggest takeaway that I want to wrap this up with, I think, is just having the space and time to really be able to reflect and think genuinely. And I know that we hear this from the time we're little, but thinking about how you would like to be treated if you were in their place.
Right. I think, you hit space and time.
Yeah.
Often we think that we have to find the solution in the here and now. And I think that's a really good point. I think it's a really great part for us to close on with compassion in this series for this week. Members and audience to think about, how do I reflect on what I've been given? And how do I build upon that to create the compassion needed to help my organization succeed?
And what are you doing to digest that?
Yeah. Digesting it, understanding, and bringing it all together. And so thank you, Julie, today.
Thank you.
That is episode 1 for everybody. These go quick. These could be hour-long episodes if we had to. But stay tuned. Join us next week. We're going to be going into episode 2, which is leading with compassion. Now that we've identified the foundation of what compassion is and utilizing with empathy into compassion, now we're going to talk about turning that intention into an impact. And so next week, we'll be back with Julie, and we will go into leading with compassion.